Elias Thatcher had sworn on his mother's grave that he would never again set foot in Wyoming Territory. But grief has a way of making liars out of even the most stubborn men. And so, on a gray morning in the spring of 1878, he rode into the town of Larkspur Creek to bury the father he had spent 17 years trying to forget. The town had not changed much from what little he remembered of it, though he had only passed through as a boy of 13, clinging to the back of a wagon, while his mother wept and his father rode ahead on a black gelding, already halfway gone from their lives even before he vanished for good. Larkspur Creek was still just a scattering of clapboard buildings along a dirt street, a church with a leaning steeple, a mercantile, a saloon called the Silver Spur, and beyond the town's edge, the creek itself, silver and cold, winding down from the foothills toward the wide Wyoming plain. Elias reined in his horse at the top of the ridge and looked down at the town for a long moment before he made himself ride on. His jaw was tight beneath a week's growth of beard, and the telegram that had brought him here was folded so many times in his coat pocket that the creases had begun to tear. Elias Thatcher died March 3 RD. Funeral arrangements pending your arrival. Matters of land and debt to settle. Come if you are able. Signed, Marshall T. Whitfield. He had read those words 100 times on the long ride from Cheyenne, and each time they struck him the same way, like a fist to a bruise that never fully healed. His father was dead. The man who had ridden off with nothing but a Colt peacemaker and a bottle of whiskey, leaving a wife and a boy to fend for themselves on a played-out homestead in Nebraska, was dead, and somehow the world expected Elias to come and grieve for him. He did not know if he could grieve for a man he had spent so many years hating. The street was quiet when he rode in, save for the creak of a wagon wheel and the low murmur of voices from the mercantile porch. A few heads turned to watch the stranger pass, taking in the dust on his coat, the rifle in its scabbard, the careful, weary posture of a man who had ridden hard and long. Elias did not stop until he reached the small clapboard building with a shingle that read Marshall, and there he dismounted, tied his horse to the post, and went inside. Marshal Tom Whitfield was a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 50, with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen enough of the territory's hard edges to soften rather than harden him. He looked up from his desk when the door opened, and something in his face shifted at once into recognition, though he had never met Elias Thatcher before in his life. "You've got his eyes," Whitfield said, standing. "Same look Silas had back before the drink took the shine out of them. You'd be Elias." "I would." Elias did not offer his hand, and after a moment Whitfield did not press him to. "I'm sorry for your loss," the marshal said. "Are you?" It was not quite a question. Elias moved to the window, looking out at the street, at the mountains rising blue and distant beyond the rooftops. "I got your telegram 3 weeks after you sent it. Took that long to catch up with me in Cheyenne." "I assume you've already buried him." "No," Whitfield said. "We held off. Doc Gentry's girl insisted on it. Said your father asked for you by name near the end, and it wasn't right to put him in the ground without giving you the chance to say your piece, whatever that piece might be." He paused, studying Elias carefully. "The service is set for tomorrow morning at the church, if that suits you." Elias said nothing for a long moment. Outside, a woman crossed the street with a basket over her arm, and a dog barked somewhere near the livery. It all seemed impossibly ordinary for a town that was about to bury the man whose name Elias had not spoken aloud in a decade. "Whoever this girl is," Elias said finally, "she had no right to hold up a burial on my account." "Maybe not," Whitfield allowed. "But she did it anyway, and if you knew half of what she did for your father in his last months, you might not be so quick to judge her for it. Her name's Maggie Gentry. Her father's the town doctor. She nursed Silas through the worst of it, right up until the end, when nobody else would go near him on account of the fever they feared he carried. Turned out it wasn't fever at all. It was an old wound from years back that never healed right, finally poisoning his blood. But she didn't know that when she sat with him night after night." Elias felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest, an unwelcome kindness intruding on a grief he had built his walls around long ago. "I don't need her charity or anyone else's, Marshal. I came to bury him and settle whatever debts he left, and then I mean to be gone from this town." "That's your business," Whitfield said evenly. "But you might want to speak with Miss Gentry before you go anywhere. Your father left something with her. Said it was for you and only you, and that she wasn't to hand it over until you came asking for it yourself." That gave Elias pause, though he did not let it show on his face. "What kind of something?" "That," Whitfield said, "is between you and her." Elias found the Gentry house at the edge of town, a tidy clapboard structure with a shingle by the door reading A. Gentry, physician. He stood on the porch for a full minute before he made himself knock, feeling foolish and raw in a way he had not felt since he was a boy waiting up nights for a father who never came home. When the door opened, it was not an old man who answered, but a young woman with dark hair pulled back beneath a plain gray bonnet, sleeves rolled to the elbow as though she had been in the middle of some task, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, gray-green and steady. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, before he had even given his name, and something in the way she said it, quiet and certain, told him she had been expecting him for weeks. "I'm Maggie Gentry. I suppose you'd better come in." The front room of the Gentry house doubled as a waiting room for her father's patients, with a row of wooden chairs along one wall and a shelf of medicine bottles along another, their labels written in a careful, looping hand. Maggie led him past this into a smaller sitting room, where a fire burned low in the hearth despite the mild spring weather, and gestured for him to sit. He did not. "You held up my father's funeral," he said, before she could speak again. "I understand you meant well by it, but it wasn't your place to decide." If he expected her to flinch or apologize, she did neither. She stood with her hands folded before her, chin lifted, and regarded him with the same steady calm she might have used on an ailing patient who did not yet understand what was good for him. "Your father asked for you every day for the last 3 weeks of his life," she said. "He didn't expect you to come. He told me so himself more than once, usually late at night when the fever had him talking more than he meant to. He said you had every right to hate him and every right to stay away, and he wouldn't blame you if you did. But he hoped." Her voice did not waver. "And so I held up the burial, because a man ought to be given the chance to be forgiven, or at least to be heard, before he's put in the ground where no one can ever ask him anything again. If that offends you, Mr. Thatcher, I'm sorry for it, but I'd do the same thing twice over." Elias felt the fight go out of him, not because she had won an argument, but because there was nothing false in what she said, no pity in it, only a plain and stubborn honesty that reminded him, uncomfortably, of his own mother in her better years, before grief and hard work had worn her down to nothing. "The Marshal said you had something of his," Elias said. "For me." Maggie crossed to a small writing desk in the corner of the room and drew out a thin leather-bound journal, worn soft at the edges, and a single folded letter sealed with wax. She held them both out to him, and when he took them, her fingers brushed his briefly, and something in that small contact seemed to steady them both. "He wrote in that journal most nights near the end," she said. "And the letter he wrote a dozen times over before he was satisfied with it. Made me read it back to him twice to be sure he'd said what he meant. I haven't read either of them beyond what he asked me to hear aloud for his own comfort. Whatever's in them is yours to know, and no one else's." Elias looked down at the journal in his hands, the leather worn smooth by years of handling, and felt his throat tighten in a way he despised. "Why would he leave this with you and not with the Marshal or a lawyer?" "Because he trusted me," Maggie said simply. "And because I think he knew that if you came looking for the truth of him, you'd need someone to tell you what these pages can't. I was with him at the end, Mr. Thatcher. I know things about your father these last years that maybe even his own journal doesn't say plain." "And what would that be?" Maggie studied him a moment before she answered, as though weighing how much a grieving, angry man could bear to hear all at once. that he spent every year since he came to this town trying to become someone worth forgiving. Whether he managed it is for you to decide. But he tried, Mr. Thatcher. Lord knows he tried. Elias did not sleep that night in the small room he had taken above the Silver Spur saloon. He sat instead by a single guttering lamp, the journal open on the table before him, and read his father's cramped, uneven hand by degrees, forcing himself through pages that alternately enraged him and undid him entirely. The early entries were sparse, businesslike, notes on cattle and weather and the price of feed, the words of a man rebuilding a life from nothing after riding into Larkspur Creek, half dead from a bullet wound he never explained to anyone. But as the months passed into years, the entries grew longer, more searching, until by the third year they had become something closer to confession. I keep thinking of the boy, one entry read, dated some 6 years back. Elias would be near 24 now, a grown man, and here I sit wondering if he remembers my face at all, or if he's had the good sense to forget it entire. I did him a kindness leaving, whatever else I did wrong. A boy is better off without a father who brings nothing home but trouble and a reputation that gets men killed for looking at him wrong. But I think of him anyway. God help me, I think of him every day. Further on, another entry, this one shorter, more raw, sent another draft to the bank in Omaha today, same as every year. The lawyer there says the boy finished his schooling fine, reads and writes better than I ever did, working now as a surveyor for the railroad, they say. I told the lawyer not to say where the money comes from. Wouldn't do the boy any good to know his father's blood money paid for his letters. Better he thinks it was his mother's people, God rest her, than know the truth of it. Elias sat back from the table, the lamp flickering low, and felt something crack open inside his chest that he had kept sealed for a very long time. He had wondered, all through his boyhood and into his young manhood, how his mother's meager savings had stretched far enough to see him properly schooled, how the mysterious drafts from an Omaha bank had arrived each year like clockwork until he was grown and settled in his trade. He had assumed it was charity from his mother's family, distant cousins who wanted nothing to do with them otherwise, but felt some obligation of blood. He had never once imagined it was his father, the man who had ridden away and never sent so much as a letter, quietly paying for a life he was not permitted to be part of. He read on, deep into the night, learning of a town under threat from a cattle baron named Jasper Cole, who had been buying up water rights along the creek and trying to force out the smaller ranchers and homesteaders who depended on it, learning that his father had stood against Cole more than once, not with threats or violence, but by helping the town organize, by using what little reputation remained to him as leverage, by refusing again and again to sell the modest parcel of land he had claimed near the creek's best bend, land Cole wanted badly enough to make repeated, escalating offers for it. He is going to try something worse before long, one of the final entries read, the hand shakier now, betraying the illness that would soon claim him. I can feel it coming the way you feel weather in an old wound. If anything happens to me before I can see this through, there's a strongbox under the floor of the smithy, second board from the west wall. Papers in there that prove what Cole did to Ezra Vance's herd 2 winters back and worse besides. The town will need that, whatever happens to me. Elias closed the journal at last as the sky outside his window began to gray with dawn, and sat for a long while with his father's letter still unopened before him, wax seal unbroken. He was not ready, not yet, to read whatever final words the old man had left for him. He needed first to bury him, to stand at the grave of a stranger who had, it seemed, spent the last years of his life trying quietly, imperfectly, to become a man worth mourning. The church was full the next morning, fuller than Elias had expected for a man he remembered only as a gunslinger and a deserter. Ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers, a handful of grizzled cowhands who had ridden in from outlying spreads, all crowded into the small clapboard building to see Elias Thatcher laid to rest. Elias sat in the front pew beside Marshal Whitfield, feeling every eye in the room settle on him at some point during the brief, plain service, measuring him, perhaps, against the man in the coffin. Maggie Gentry sat 2 rows back with her father, Doc Abraham Gentry, a stooped, kindly-looking man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. When the minister finished his remarks and asked if anyone wished to speak, it was Maggie who rose first, smoothing her dark skirt, and turned to face the gathered mourners. "I won't stand here and tell you Elias Thatcher was a saint," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady through the small church. "Most of you remember well enough what he was before he came to Larkspur Creek, and some of you have scars, one way or another, to prove it. But I nursed that man through his last 3 months of life, and I can tell you what I saw. I saw a man who gave half his cattle away to families who'd lost their own herds to hard winters, and never once let it be known it was him that did it. I saw a man who stood at the edge of his own land with an empty gun in his belt, because he'd sworn off using it, and still faced down Jasper Cole's riders when they came to burn Ezra Vance's fence line. I saw a man who spent his last strength writing letters to a son he was afraid to send, because he thought silence was kinder than an apology he didn't believe he'd earned." She paused, and her eyes found Elias in the front pew, though her words were for the whole room. "Whatever he was once, he spent his last years trying hard to be something better. I think that ought to count for something when we're weighing a man's soul." The church was silent when she finished, and Elias sat with his hands clenched tight on his knees, unable to look at anyone, least of all the plain pine coffin at the front of the room that held all that remained of his father. They buried Elias Thatcher on a low rise above the creek, beneath a lone cottonwood tree just beginning to bud with the spring, and Elias stood at the graveside long after the other mourners had filed away back toward town, staring down at the raw earth mound until the sun stood high overhead and his legs ached from standing. "You don't have to make peace with him today," said a voice behind him, and he turned to find Maggie Gentry standing a respectful distance away, her bonnet in her hands, dark hair loosened somewhat by the wind off the creek. "Some things take longer than a single afternoon. I don't know that I'll ever make peace with him," Elias said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "He left us, Miss Gentry. My mother worked herself into an early grave trying to keep us fed after he rode off, and I spent my boyhood hating the sound of his name. And now I come here and find out he was giving away cattle and writing letters he never sent, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. I don't know if it's supposed to make it better." Maggie moved closer until she stood beside him at the graveside and looked down at the mound of earth with an expression that held more sympathy than judgment. "I don't think it's supposed to make it better," she said. "I think it's supposed to make it more complicated. Grief usually is. My mother died when I was 12, and it took me years to stop being angry at her for it, even though dying wasn't rightly her fault. Anger doesn't always follow the rules of who deserves it." She looked up at him. "For what it's worth, I don't think your father expected forgiveness. I think he'd have settled for you knowing the truth of him, whatever you decided to do with it after." Elias was quiet a long moment, watching the creek water run silver and quick below the rise. "You cared for him," he said finally. "Why, he was nothing to you." "He was something to this town," Maggie said. "And besides, my father's the only doctor for 30 miles, and I've been helping him tend the sick and the dying since I was old enough to boil water. You learn doing that kind of work that most people aren't all one thing, even the hard ones. Even the ones everybody's got a story about." She hesitated, then added more gently, "He talked about you more than he talked about anything else at the end. I think you should know that, whatever else you decide to believe." Elias did not answer her directly, but something in his chest loosened, just slightly, standing there above his father's grave with the wind moving through the cottonwood's new leaves. Over the following days, Elias found reasons to linger in Larkspur Creek that had little to do with the debts and land his father had left him, though those were considerable enough. There was the modest homestead itself, a cabin and a barn and near 200 acres running along the creek's best bend, along with a small herd of cattle that had been left largely to fend for themselves under the loose supervision of a hired hand named Rufus Cobb, an old cowhand who had known Elias Thatcher since his first year in the territory. "Your daddy was a hard man to know," Rufus told him one afternoon, as the two of them walked the fence line together, checking for breaks. "Kept to himself mostly first few years he was here. Didn't talk much about his past, and nobody pushed him on it because there was something in his eyes that told you not to. But he had a way of showing up right when folks needed him most. Barn burns down, he's there with lumber before you even ask. Somebody's cattle get sick, he's out riding half the night looking for a strayed calf. Never made a show of it. Just did it, quiet-like, and rode off before you could thank him proper." "Doesn't sound like the man I remember," Elias said. "Maybe not," Rufus allowed. "But I expect a man can change more in 17 years than you'd credit, especially if he's got something eating at him the whole while. Your daddy carried a weight, son. I saw it plain enough, even if I never knew exactly what it was he was carrying. I expect you know better than most now." Elias found himself returning to the Gentry house more often than strict business required, ostensibly to consult with Doc Gentry about the settling of his father's affairs, since the old doctor had also served as something of an informal notary for the town's legal matters. But in truth, he came as much to see Maggie as to see her father. She had a way of speaking to him that neither coddled his grief nor dismissed it, and he found himself, almost against his will, drawn to the quiet strength of her, the steadiness with which she moved through a world that had clearly asked hard things of her more than once. "Your father used to sit right there," she told him one evening, nodding toward a chair by the sitting-room window, "and tell me stories about the cattle drives he rode as a young man, before things went bad for him. He had a fine way of telling a story when the fever let him, made even the hard years sound almost fine the way he told it." "What went bad for him?" Elias asked. "He mentioned something in the journal about a debt of blood, but he never said plain what he meant." Maggie's expression grew careful. "That's not really mine to tell, Mr. Thatcher. Some of it he told me in confidence, and some of it he never finished telling before the fever took the words from him. I think you'll find more of it in his letter if you can bring yourself to read it." Elias looked down at his hands, still calloused from years of surveying work, measuring land for railroads that cared nothing for the men and families whose lives were disrupted by the iron rails. "I haven't opened it yet." "Why not?" "Because as long as I haven't read it," Elias admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it, "I can still be angry at him without any complications. Once I read it, I suspect that's not going to be so simple anymore." Maggie considered this for a long moment, and something soft moved behind her gray-green eyes. "Grief's rarely simple, Mr. Thatcher, whether you read the letter or not. I think you already know that." "Elias," he said. "You can call me Elias if you're going to keep telling me hard truths at every turn. Seems only fair." A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth, the first he had seen from her since his arrival. "All right then, Elias." It was nearly 2 weeks after the funeral, on an evening heavy with the smell of rain on the wind, that Jasper Cole rode into Larkspur Creek with 4 of his men and stopped his horse in front of the Silver Spur, where Elias happened to be standing on the boardwalk, discussing feed prices with Rufus Cobb. Cole was a tall man, silver-haired and well-dressed for the territory, in a black coat that had never seen a day's honest ranch work, and he looked Elias over with the frank appraisal of a man accustomed to sizing up obstacles. "You'd be the Thatcher boy," Cole said, not bothering to dismount. "Come to collect your inheritance, I take it." "I've come to bury my father," Elias said evenly. "The rest is my business." "Everything along this creek is my business, one way or another," Cole said, with the easy confidence of a man who had said such things many times before and rarely been contradicted. "Your father held onto a parcel of land that sits square in the middle of what I need for my herds. Made things difficult for me, more than once." I'm prepared to make you a generous offer for that land, Mr. Thatcher, generous enough that you could ride back to wherever you came from and never think of this town again. I'd advise you to consider it seriously before you decide to be as stubborn as your father was." "I haven't decided anything yet," Elias said. "I've been in town 2 weeks, Mr. Cole. Give me time to grieve my father before you start haggling over his grave." Cole's smile did not waver, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "Grief is a luxury, son. Out here, it's a luxury a man can't always afford." He turned his horse and rode off down the street with his men trailing behind him, and Elias stood watching them go with a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "That's the man your father spent years standing against," Rufus said quietly, once Cole and his riders were out of earshot. "He's been buying up water rights all along the creek for near 5 years now, and any rancher who won't sell finds their herds coming up sick, or their fences cut, or worse. Ezra Vance lost half his cattle 2 winters back to what everybody suspects was poisoned feed, though nobody could ever prove Cole's hand in it. Your daddy's land is the last piece Cole needs to control the whole stretch of water this side of the mountains. Once he's got that, there's nothing stopping him from squeezing every small outfit along this creek dry." Elias thought of the strongbox his father had written about in the journal, hidden beneath the floor of the smithy, papers that proved what Cole had done to Ezra Vance's herd 2 winters back, and worse besides. That night, he finally broke the wax seal on his father's letter. "My son," it began, and Elias had to stop there for a long moment before he could make himself continue, his eyes burning in the lamplight. "I have started this letter more times than I care to admit, and torn up more pages than I've kept, because I cannot seem to find the words that would make right what I did wrong. I left you and your mother when you needed me most, and I did it for reasons that seemed sound to me then, though I have had 17 years to reconsider them, and I no longer believe there was any good reason for what I did. I told myself you were better off without a man who carried the kind of trouble I carried, and maybe there was some small truth in that, but the greater truth is that I was a coward. It was easier to run from the weight of being a husband and a father than to stay and carry it, and I have regretted my cowardice every day since. I will not ask you to forgive me, because I do not believe forgiveness is a thing that can be asked for. It is only a thing that can be given, freely or not at all, and I have no right to expect it of you. But I want you to know that I spent every year since I came to this town trying to become a man who deserved, even a little, to be your father again. I do not know if I succeeded. That judgment belongs to you, and to the people of this town who watch me try. There is a matter of unfinished business that I must leave to you, because I fear I will not live to see it through myself. Jasper Cole has done wrong to this town for years, and I have gathered proof of it, hidden where you will find it if you look. I ask you to see this through, not because it is owed to me, but because it is owed to the good people who took me in when I had nothing, and who deserve better than to be crushed under a rich man's greed. You were always a fair-minded boy, even as small as you were when I left. I trust that fairness has grown into something a man could be proud of. Whatever else you decide about me, know that I loved you every day of every year I was gone, even when I had no right to that love, even when the only way I knew to show it was in secret, from a distance, through drafts sent to a bank you never knew came from your father's hand. I am sorry, Elias. I am sorrier than these poor words can say. I hope, when you are old yourself, and looking back on your own life, that you will find some way to remember me kindly, even if it takes you the rest of your days to get there. Your father, Elias Thatcher. Elias sat with the letter in his hands for a long time after he finished reading it, the lamp burning low, the rain that had threatened all evening finally beginning to patter against the window glass. He did not weep, not exactly, but something in him that had been clenched tight for 17 years finally, slowly, began to loosen its grip, and in its place came something he had not expected to feel. A fierce, sudden determination to finish what his father had started. He went to the smithy the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and found the second board from the west wall just as the journal had described, loose enough to pry up with his knife. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from damp, was a small strongbox, and inside that, a collection of papers that made his stomach turn as he read through them. Bills of sale showing Cole's purchase of a particular strain of feed known to cause sickness in cattle, a witness statement from a former hand of Cole's, swearing he had been paid to poison Ezra Vance's herd, letters between Cole and a land agent in Cheyenne detailing a scheme to force homesteaders off their claims through intimidation and sabotage, so that Cole could buy up the abandoned land for a fraction of its worth. It was enough, Elias thought, studying the papers with the careful eye of a man who had spent years reading surveys and legal claims for the railroad. It was enough to see Jasper Cole ruined if it could be gotten in front of the right territorial judge. But first, he would need to keep it safe and keep himself alive long enough to see it there. He brought the strongbox to Marshal Whitfield's office that same morning, and the two of them, along with Doc Gentry, who had ridden over at Whitfield's request, spread the papers across the marshal's desk and studied them in grim silence. "This is enough to hang him," Whitfield said finally, "or at least see him run clean out of the territory. But Cole's got money enough to buy a judge in Cheyenne, and he's got 4 hired guns riding with him who won't take kindly to seeing their boss brought low. We'll need to move careful, and we'll need more than just this paper. We'll need witnesses willing to stand up in a courtroom, and out here, that's asking men to risk their necks." "My father managed to gather this much on his own," Elias said. "Surely there are people in this town willing to finish what he started." "Your father had something most men don't," Doc Gentry said quietly, adjusting his spectacles. "He had a reputation that made Cole's men think twice before crossing him outright. Whatever else Elias Thatcher was, word travels in this territory, and men remembered what he'd been before he came here. That reputation bought him room to move that an ordinary rancher wouldn't have. You don't have that same protection, son, and neither do the rest of us." Elias thought of his father's Colt Peacemaker, which Rufus Cobb had given to him the week before, wrapped in a worn leather holster, the one weapon Elias Thatcher had kept from his old life, though by every account he had refused to wear it in his later years, choosing instead to walk unarmed even when Cole's riders came to burn his neighbor's fences. "Maybe it's time this town had a little more protection then," Elias said, and something in his voice made both older men look up at him with new attention. That evening, word reached the marshal's office that one of Cole's riders had been seen near Ezra Vance's spread again, and by the time Elias and Whitfield arrived, they found a section of fence cut and a small fire smoldering dangerously close to a hay barn, though it had not yet caught. Vance himself, a weathered rancher of perhaps 60, stood in his yard with a shotgun cradled in his arms, shaking with a mixture of fury and fear. "Third time this month," Vance said, when Whitfield asked what had happened. "They don't even bother hiding their faces anymore. Cole's got no fear of the law out here, Marshal, and everybody in this valley knows it." "That's about to change," Elias said, before he had quite decided to say it, and both men looked at him in surprise. "We've got proof enough to bring federal charges against Cole for what he did to your herd 2 winters back, Mr. Vance, and for a dozen other things besides. But it's going to take every rancher in this valley standing together and refusing to be run off, or bought off, or scared into silence. My father spent years trying to build that kind of courage in this town. I mean to see it finished." Vance studied him for a long moment, taking in the resemblance to the man he had known, and something in his weathered face softened. "Your daddy said something almost exactly like that to me the day he first came asking why I hadn't reported the poisoned feed to the marshal. Called me a coward for staying quiet." He managed a thin smile. "Reckon it runs in the family, that kind of talk." Word spread through the valley over the following days that the ranchers and homesteaders along Larkspur Creek, intended to stand together against Jasper Cole, backed by evidence that Elias Thatcher had spent his final years gathering, and carried forward now by the son he had left behind. Elias found himself, almost without meaning to, taking on something of his father's old role, riding from spread to spread with Marshal Whitfield to gather statements and shore up the resolve of frightened families who had grown accustomed to keeping their heads down. Maggie rode with them more than once, tending to a child with a fever at one homestead, setting a broken arm at another, her calm presence doing as much to steady the valley's nerve as any legal document could. Elias watched her work with a growing admiration that he was slow to name for what it truly was, though the moment came, inevitably, when he could no longer pretend it was only respect he felt. They had stopped for the night at the Vance Ranch, on their way back from a distant homestead near the mountain's base, and Maggie sat beside him on the porch steps while the stars came out cold and bright overhead, the Wyoming sky stretching vast and unbroken from ridge to ridge. "You've changed since you first rode into town," she said, watching him in the dim light spilling from the ranch house window. "You were so angry that first day. I half thought you'd bury your father and ride out again within the week." "I thought so too," Elias admitted. "I came here meaning to settle a debt and leave a place I never wanted to see again. I didn't expect to find a fight worth staying for." "I didn't expect to find." He hesitated, and Maggie turned to look at him more directly, waiting. "To find what?" she asked, and there was something careful in her voice, as though she suspected the answer and was not certain she was ready to hear it said aloud. "You," Elias said simply, because he had never been a man for pretty words, only plain ones. "I didn't expect to find you, Maggie Gentry. I came here hating my father, and instead I've found myself grateful to him, in a strange way, because if he hadn't died, I never would have ridden into this town and met you." Maggie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes bright in the starlight. "That's a hard thing to be grateful for," she said softly. "A man's death, I mean." "I know it," Elias said. "I'm not glad he's gone. I'd give a great deal to have had the chance to know him properly, to have had even a single conversation with him while he still breathed. But I can be sorry for that and grateful for you both at once. I don't think those things have to cancel each other out." "No," Maggie agreed, and something in her voice had softened further still. "I don't suppose they do." He did not kiss her that night, though the temptation sat heavy between them on the porch steps, because he was not a man who moved quickly in matters of the heart, and he sensed, correctly, that Maggie Gentry was not a woman who wished to be rushed. But something had shifted between them, an understanding reached without the need for further words, and when they rode back toward town the following morning, they rode close together, and neither minded when their horses' shoulders brushed on the narrow trail. The confrontation with Jasper Cole came a week later, on a morning when the valley's ranchers had gathered at the marshal's office to sign sworn statements before riding as a body to the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, where a federal judge had agreed, on the strength of Whitfield's telegraphed report, to hear the charges against Cole. Word of the gathering had reached Cole himself, and he arrived in town with all 4 of his hired riders before the ranchers could depart, positioning his men across the street from the marshal's office with the casual menace of a man accustomed to solving his problems with intimidation rather than law. "I'll not have this town ruin what I've spent years building," Cole called out from atop his horse, as Elias and Whitfield stepped onto the boardwalk to meet him. "You've got no proof that would stand in any real courtroom, Thatcher, and you know it. Best you and your friends climb down off this foolishness before somebody gets hurt who doesn't need to." "We've got sworn statements and documents in your own hand, Cole," Elias said, standing his ground though his heart hammered hard against his ribs. "You can threaten this town all you like, but it won't change what's already written down and copied 3 times over, sent by rider to Cheyenne 2 days past. Even if you silence every soul standing here today, the judge already has what he needs." Something flickered across Cole's composed face, the first crack Elias had seen in the man's confidence. "You're bluffing." "Ride to Cheyenne yourself and find out," Whitfield said evenly, his hand resting near his own holstered pistol, though he made no move to draw it. "But I'd advise against making things worse for yourself here today, Jasper. There's a whole valley of witnesses on this street who'd swear to whatever happens next." For a long, taut moment, nothing moved. Cole's riders shifted in their saddles, hands hovering near their own weapons, and Elias was acutely aware of his father's Colt sitting heavy in the holster at his hip, a weapon he had sworn he would never need to draw, though he had strapped it on that morning with hands that would not stop trembling until the leather was settled against his leg. It was Boone Slade, the largest and roughest of Cole's riders, who broke the stillness, his patience thinning faster than his employer's caution. "Enough of this talk," he growled, and his hand dropped toward his pistol. What happened next occurred in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, though it would feel far longer in the retelling for years afterward. Elias' hand moved to his father's Colt on pure instinct, faster than he had known himself capable of, and he fired a single shot that struck Slade's gun hand before the man had fully cleared his holster, sending the pistol spinning into the dust of the street. Slade howled and clutched his bloodied hand, and in the same instant, Whitfield had his own weapon drawn and leveled at Cole himself, and half a dozen ranchers who had been standing nearby, armed with rifles and shotguns of their own, stepped forward to make plain that the numbers had shifted decisively against Cole's remaining men. "Nobody else needs to bleed here today," Elias said, his voice steadier than he felt, the Colt still smoking in his hand. "But I'll not stand by and watch this town be terrorized any longer, Cole. Your choice now is to ride to Cheyenne and answer for what you've done in front of a judge, or to keep running, and let every lawman between here and the Dakota line know you fled rather than face what's coming. Either way, this valley is done being afraid of you." Cole looked around at his remaining riders, at the ring of armed ranchers, at Slade bleeding and cursing in the street, and something in the calculation behind his eyes finally, visibly, gave way to defeat. "This isn't finished," he said, though the words carried little conviction now. "It's finished enough," Whitfield said. "You're under arrest, Jasper Cole, on charges of cattle poisoning, arson, and conspiracy against the homesteaders of this valley. You can ride to Cheyenne under guard, or you can spend the trip in irons in the back of a wagon. Your choice." Cole chose, in the end, to ride under guard, and the small procession that left Larkspur Creek that afternoon, bound for the territorial courthouse, included not only Cole and his surrendered men, but half the valley's ranchers riding as witnesses, determined to see justice done after years of quiet suffering under Cole's schemes. Elias did not go with them. He remained behind at Maggie's insistence, his hand needing tending where the recoil of his father's old Colt had torn the skin at the base of his thumb, a minor wound that nonetheless required careful cleaning to prevent infection in an age when even small injuries could turn deadly. "You did well today," Maggie told him, as she worked a needle and thread through the torn skin with careful, practiced hands, in the small clinic room at the back of her father's house. "Better than well. You stopped a man's violence without killing him, and you gave this valley a chance at justice it hasn't had in years. Your father would be proud of you. I don't know if that matters to me the way it might have a month ago," Elias said, watching her work with a strange, quiet contentment settling over him despite the throb of his injured hand. "I came here angry at a dead man, Maggie, and I find myself instead grateful for the chance to finish what he started. I think that's a kind of forgiveness, even if I never quite found the words for it." "I think it's the truest kind there is," Maggie said softly, tying off the last stitch and setting down her needle. "Not the kind that comes easy in a moment of feeling, but the kind that comes slow, through action, through choosing to carry forward what someone else couldn't finish themselves. I think Silas would have understood that better than most." Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, at the steady competence in her hands, the compassion that had never once curdled into pity, the plain, unflinching honesty she had offered him from the very first day he arrived in Larkspur Creek angry and grieving and utterly lost. "Maggie," he said, I think I've fallen in love with you, somewhere between burying my father and standing against Cole in that street. I didn't plan for it. I don't know that I deserve it, given everything else that's happened this month. But I don't think I can keep pretending it isn't true. Maggie's hand stilled on the edge of the small table between them, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, though she smiled through them. I fell for you somewhere around the third day, she admitted. Watching you read that journal by lamplight, so angry and so lost, and still trying so hard to understand a man who'd hurt you badly. I told myself it was foolish, falling for a man who'd made it plain he meant to leave this town the moment his business here was finished. I don't mean to leave anymore, Elias said. Not this town, and not you if you'll have me. I've got a homestead now, and cattle that need tending, and a valley that could use another pair of hands willing to stand up when it matters. I've got no interest in going back to surveying land for railroads that don't care what they trample to lay their tracks. I'd rather build something here. With you, if you're willing. Maggie set aside her medical supplies entirely now and reached for his uninjured hand, holding it between both of hers with a tenderness that made his chest ache in the best possible way. I've spent my whole life in this valley, tending to other people's wounds, other people's fears, she said. I never let myself think much about what I wanted for my own life, because there was always someone who needed me more urgently than I needed myself. But I want this, Elias. I want you, and whatever life we might build together in this valley, if you're truly certain it's what you want too. I've never been more certain of anything, Elias said. And then, because there seemed nothing else left to say that words could capture better, he leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, and then with the full weight of everything he had been carrying and finally, blessedly, set down. Jasper Cole was convicted before the territorial judge in Cheyenne 3 weeks later, on charges that saw him stripped of his land holdings along Larkspur Creek and sentenced to a term in the territorial prison. His ill-gotten water rights returned by court order to the ranchers and homesteaders he had spent years trying to squeeze out. Boone Slade and the other riders, having testified against their former employer in exchange for lighter sentences, scattered to other territories, and Larkspur Creek settled, for the first time in years, into a peace that did not depend on the presence of a gunslinger, reformed or otherwise, to hold the wolves at bay. Elias took up residence at his father's homestead in earnest that summer, working alongside Rufus Cobb to rebuild the herd and mend the fences that Cole's men had cut in their years of harassment. And though the work was hard and unfamiliar to hands more accustomed to survey chains and ledger books, he found in it a satisfaction he had not expected, a sense of putting down roots in soil his father had once claimed and defended, imperfectly, with everything he had left. He and Maggie were married that autumn, in the same small church where Elias Thatcher had been laid to rest 6 months before, with the whole valley turning out to witness the joining of the gunslinger's estranged son and the doctor's steady, compassionate daughter, a union that seemed to many of the gathered townsfolk like a fitting close to a story that had begun in bitterness and ended, against all expectation, in something like grace. Doc Gentry gave his daughter away with tears standing openly in his eyes, and Marshal Whitfield stood as witness for Elias, since there was no family of his own blood left living to stand in that role, his mother long past and his father only recently, finally, at peace beneath the cottonwood tree above the creek. Rufus Cobb wept unashamedly through the whole ceremony and claimed afterward it was only dust in his eyes, and Ezra Vance and a dozen other ranchers, whose livelihoods had been saved by Elias and Maggie's courage that spring brought gifts of cattle and quilts, and preserved fruit enough to see the newlyweds through their first winter in comfort. Elias visited his father's grave that evening alone, before the wedding celebration carried him away into the long night of dancing and toasting that the town insisted on holding at the Silver Spur. He stood beneath the cottonwood tree, its leaves full and green now with the fullness of autumn approaching, and spoke aloud to the quiet earth for the first time since the funeral. "I forgive you," he said simply. "I don't know that I fully understood when I rode into this town what that forgiveness would cost me or what it would give me in return, but I understand now. You tried in your own broken way to become a man worth remembering kindly, and I think you managed it in the end, whatever it cost you to get there. I married a fine woman today, Pa Maggie Gentry, though I suppose she's Maggie Thatcher now. I think you'd have liked her. I think she'd have liked you too, the man you became, even if she never had the chance to know the man you once were." He touched the simple wooden marker that stood at the head of the grave, and then turned back toward town, toward the lights and music of his own wedding celebration, carrying with him at last a peace he had not known he was capable of finding when he first crested the ridge above Larkspur Creek, angry and grieving, and utterly certain he would never call this valley home. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as no life on the Wyoming frontier could be entirely free of struggle, but they were, on the whole, years of a steadily deepening happiness that neither Elias nor Maggie had quite dared to hope for in their harder, lonelier days. The ranch prospered under their joint care, Elias' careful, methodical mind well suited to the business of breeding and managing a growing herd, while Maggie continued to assist her aging father with the town's medical needs, training under his guidance until she had become, in her own right, nearly as skilled a healer as he was, a fact that would serve the valley well as Doc Gentry's hands grew less steady with age. Their first child arrived in the spring of 1879, a son, born during a late snowstorm that kept the roads impassable for 3 days and had Elias half out of his mind with worry, until Doc Gentry himself arrived on horseback through the drifts to assist his daughter through a labor that proved, in the end, difficult but ultimately safe. They named the boy Silas after his grandfather, a choice that surprised some in the valley who remembered the elder Thatcher's harder years, but which felt to Elias like the truest possible tribute to a man who had spent his final years trying, however imperfectly, to earn back a name worth passing on. "He has your father's eyes," Maggie observed, some weeks after the birth, as she nursed the infant by the fire while Elias worked at mending a bridle nearby. "That same steady, searching look, even this young. I hope he grows into a gentler version of that look than either of us knew for most of our lives," Elias said, though he smiled as he said it, watching his son's small fist curl around his mother's finger. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Rose after Elias' own mother, a name that carried its own quiet weight of remembrance and healing, honoring a woman who had suffered greatly for a husband's failures but who had raised her son, despite everything, to become a man capable of forgiveness, courage, and love. Doc Gentry doted on his granddaughter with an open, unashamed joy that softened even further the last of his advancing years, and Marshall Whitfield, who had never married nor had children of his own, took to the role of honorary uncle to both Thatcher children with a gruff tenderness that surprised no one who had watched him navigate the valley's troubles with such steady patience over the years. Rufus Cobb remained on the Thatcher ranch until his own passing some 8 years later, content to spend his final years teaching young Silas the ways of cattle and horses that he himself had once taught to Silas's grandfather, a continuity of knowledge and care that Elias found deeply comforting, a sense that something good and lasting had been built from the wreckage of his father's earlier failures. Larkspur Creek itself grew steadily through those years, as word spread through the territory of a valley freed from a cattle baron's tyranny, and new families arrived to take up homesteads along the water that Cole had once tried to claim entirely for himself. A schoolhouse was built, where Maggie taught reading and simple arithmetic to the valley's growing number of children on the days when her father needed no assistance with his patients, and Elias, in time, took on something of Marshall Whitfield's old role himself, serving as a deputy and later, when Whitfield finally retired to a quiet cabin by the creek, as marshal in his own right. A position he filled with a fairness and steady courage that the valley's residents came to trust as completely as they had once trusted his father's harder, more feared brand of protection. On the 10th anniversary of Elias Thatcher's death, Elias and Maggie walked together up the low rise above the creek, their two children running ahead of them through the tall spring grass to visit the grave beneath the cottonwood tree, which had grown tall and full in the years since the burial, its shade now spreading wide and cool across the small clearing. "Do you still think of him often?" Maggie asked, as they stood together looking down at the weathered marker, the wood grayed now by years of sun and rain but still legibly carved with the name Elias Thatcher, and the dates of a life that had spanned far more sorrow and redemption than most men managed in their allotted years. "Every day, in some small way," Elias admitted. "Not with the anger I carried when I first rode into this valley, but with a kind of gratitude I never expected to feel for a man who caused me and my mother so much grief. He gave me this valley in the end. He gave me you, and our children, and a life I couldn't have imagined for myself when I was riding here full of nothing but bitterness." He looked over at Maggie, at the steady warmth in her gray-green eyes that had first caught his attention on that difficult first day in her father's sitting room, and felt the same fullness of love that had grown steadily between them across a decade of shared hardship and shared joy. "I think if he could see us now, he'd be glad of how it all turned out. I think that's about the best any of us can hope for in the end, whether we deserve it or not." Young Elias, now 9 years old and already showing signs of his father's careful, thoughtful nature, came running back up the slope with a fistful of wildflowers he had gathered from the meadow below, and placed them carefully at the base of his grandfather's grave marker with the solemn seriousness that children sometimes bring to rituals they only half understand but feel, instinctively, to be important. "Was Grandpa Elias a good man?" the boy asked, looking up at his parents with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of childhood. Elias knelt down beside his son, considering the question with the same careful thought he brought to every decision that mattered. "He wasn't always," he said honestly. "He made mistakes, some of them very hard ones that hurt people he loved. But he spent the last years of his life trying very hard to fix what he could, and to protect the people who needed protecting, even when it was difficult, even when he was afraid. I think that matters more in the end than whether a man was perfect from the start. I think it matters most what a man does with the time he has left, once he understands where he went wrong." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing this with the seriousness of a boy who had grown up hearing enough of his grandfather's story, in careful, age-appropriate pieces, to understand that the world was rarely as simple as the stories in his mother's school books made it seem. "I'm glad you forgave him," the boy said simply, and then ran back down the slope to join his younger sister, who had discovered a family of prairie dogs near the fence line and was calling excitedly for her brother to come see. Elias watched his children go, and then turned back to Maggie, who slipped her hand into his with the easy familiarity of 10 years of marriage, 10 years of building something true and lasting from the wreckage of old grief and old wrongs. "So am I," Elias said quietly, looking down once more at his father's grave, at the wildflowers his son had placed there, at the tall grass and the cottonwood shade and the creek running silver and endless below them, carrying its water now to fields and herds that no longer feared a rich man's greed, thanks in no small part to a father and son who had, between the two of them, across an impossible gulf of years and silence, finally found their way to something worth calling redemption. "So am I, Maggie. More than I ever thought I could be." They stood together a while longer in the spring sunlight, watching their children play among the wildflowers, the valley spreading wide and green and full of promise all around them, before turning at last to walk back down toward the home they had built together, a home filled with love that had grown, against every hard beginning, into something as steady and enduring as the mountains themselves.